When the guns of Charleston Harbor were turned on Fort Sumter in April 1861 to open 4 bloody years of civil war, America's Indian people found themselves between 2 fires. All that had gone before, years of diplomacy, resistance, and accommodation, had now brought them all to a most difficult time in which everything was different, and all choices had to be made anew.
Fire!
By 1860, most of the Indian population which remained east of the Mississippi had come to treaty terms with the United States. Many were long gone to epidemics and years of conflict with their neighbors and with Europeans becoming Americans. In the North, most were confined to reservations a fraction of the size of their original homelands. Others, particularly in the South, had been removed beyond the Mississippi, leaving behind only intractable remnants of their people high in the hills of Carolina or deep in the Florida swamps. It was in the West where the war's effects were first felt and most profoundly.
It became apparent the entire nation was dividing, and they had a choice of supporting the Confederate States of America or the United States of America. The problem was particularly acute in the group of Native Americans known as the 5 civilized tribes. They included the Seminoles, the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, and that part of the Choctaws which had been removed. They were at that time in Indian Territory, now generally within the state boundaries of Oklahoma, and they were designated the 5 civilized tribes simply because the white people had chosen to so name them. Actually, all of the Native American tribes were civilized in a high degree with a civilization and culture of their own.
Slavery linked the 5 nations to the South. Long familiar with the pinnacle institution in their homeland, Southern Indians began to acquire significant numbers of African American slaves in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The acquisition of slaves enabled Native people to distance themselves from African Americans in an increasingly racist white society, and they adopted many of the racial attitudes of the dominant Anglo-American culture.
Many of the Confederates owned slaves, and I say to my disgust and my shame that my ancestor owned 22 human beings, and I'm very ashamed of that, and I don't like that. What happened is a form of punishment in these Reconstruction treaties. The Indians were forced to make the freedmen, the ex-slaves, were now members, full members of the Indian tribes. They had all the treaty rights they had in terms of annuities and land. There's some justice there. That doesn't bother me at all. What's interesting to me is that the Indian people who fought on the side of the South will lose millions of acres of land. Land is taken from them, largely from Kansas, because there are Indian tribes living in Kansas. And when the war is over, the Indian tribes that were in Kansas will be placed in Indian Territory, which will be present-day Oklahoma. And how they will do this is by taking a land away from the 5 tribes who owned land in Kansas. I find this very interesting in that if we look to the east, we realize that not a single acre of southern land was confiscated for the freedmen. I look at the General of the South, Robert E. Lee, who had a plantation whereupon you could sit in his front porch and look at the Capitol building. Now, he was unable to do that during the war. I understand that. But when the war was over, we gave it back to him. Of course, that is now Arlington Cemetery. But the case is that we did not take a single acre of land from Jefferson Davis, any of these people, but we will take over 10 million acres of land from the Native Americans who fought on the side of the South in the American West. And that is so unfair and so unreasonable.
Late in April 1864, the newly formed 9th Army Corps wheeled on to Pennsylvania Avenue on their way to Virginia and the hunt for Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. For 5 hours, the mostly veteran soldiers streamed by the White House, accompanied by a mix of new regiments and an entire new division of colored troops. On the balcony nearby Willard Hotel stood their Commander-in-Chief, Abraham Lincoln. In the throngs of onlookers was the poet Walt Whitman, who wrote his mother, "There were Michigan regiments, one of them a regiment of sharpshooters, partly composed of Indians." Company K of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters was indeed entirely composed of Indians, the only all-Indian unit to serve with federal forces east of the Mississippi.
I believe that these men fought first and foremost out of a sense of it being an important part of their own character and their own ability to define themselves as men, as citizens.